Okay, we are already running out of time. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our session. Our session is to discuss the issue about China and the global economic governance. We are very happy to have 5 speakers in this session. They are Dr. Axel Berger. He is a senior researcher from German Development Institute and the head of G20 Policy Research Group. And Mr. Cristian Rodriguez. He is the head of trade and investment policy from the World Economic Forum. The third speaker is from the World Bank. She is Anabel Gonzalez. She is a senior director for trade and competitiveness global practice, the World Bank Group. And the last one is the Bernard Hoekman, the professor and the director from the European University Institute in charge of the global economics and governance. I'm Longyue Zhao, professor and dean from the Guangdong University of Foreign Studies. My topic is about China's growing engagement in global economic governance. Generally speaking, China's engagement with the global economic governance can be divided into 3 stages. This is the 3 stages. The first one is before China's accession to the WTO from the late of the 1970s to the early of 2000. The second stage is from China entry to the World WTO to 2008, the financial crisis. The second stage is after 2008. China became one of the active participants in the global economic governance. At the first stage, the most important is China has begun to be immersed into the economic globalization by reform and opening up in 1978. In 1980, China became the World Bank, the member, and the IMF. In 1986, China first raised the application for restoring China's original status of the GATT. In 1991, China became a member to APEC. And in 1997, during the Asian financial crisis, China adopted stable currency policy in order to prevent the financial crisis for further spreading. That played the first active role in global economic governance for the first time. At the second stage, most significant is becoming the member of the World Trade Organization. China, during this stage, China has been focused on the revising and making domestic laws following the WTO agreement and China's commitment into the WTO members. From 2001 to 2005, China has revised and enacted more than 90,000 new laws and rules at the central government and the local government until the financial crisis of 2008. At the third stage, after the financial crisis, the international community hoped China to play more important role in the global economic governance. And China become an important actors in global economic governance passively. Until 2010, in the fifth plenum of the 7th Central Committee of Chinese Communist Party, and China first proposed to engage in the global governance. Since 2013, China's new government has paid more attention on the global governance and transferred China from a passive player into one of the active players in global governance. In the past 5 years, China had raised some more new ideas and initiatives on global economic governance. The first one, and the most important one, is the Belt and Road Initiative. This is not only a theory, but also policy and practice. The Belt and Road Initiative is not only a historical and traditional ideas, but also is full of bright new ideas, such as the 3 basic principles is to plan together, work together, and share the benefit together. Another is the 5 connectiveness. I think this one is worked. The policy coordinating, infrastructure connecting, trade facilitation, financial promotion, and for the people-to-people understanding. Second thought is through the establishment of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to promote the integration of infrastructure and the regional economy for the most developing countries. The original member for AIIB is 58, now already increased to 80 members. Third one is to host a successful summit for global economic governance. In 2014, in 2014, China hosted the 22nd APEC leaders meeting in Beijing, and in 2016, hosted the G20 summit in Hangzhou. And last year, early this year, they hosted the BRICS Xiamen Summit. Fourth one is China raised a lot of new theories. Most important theories and policies is a new type of international relations and the community of a shared future for human beings. The third idea is a balanced and inclusive economic globalization. The new type of international relations first raised during the Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Russia. The new type of international relations based on three principles, that is mutual respect, equal and justice, and one-one cooperation. At the 70th UN General Assembly, President Xi Jinping proposed to work together to create the community of a shared future for human beings. The fundamental objective is to build an open and inclusive, clean and beautiful world for our peoples to enjoy sustainable peace, universal security, and common prosperity. The fifth new idea is to build new type of relations with other major countries. This including the China-US partnership, China-European strategic cooperative partnership, and China-Russia and China-India, as well as other countries in Asia, Africa, and South America. The sixth idea is that China adhere to the multilateral system, including trade, oppose the trade protectionism, investment, and the global security system led by the United Nations. The seventh is China adopted a series opening up policies unilaterally. Recently, further reduced the tariffs for the goods trade, and as well as to open the trade in service and organize the important fair in Shanghai next year for import. And also now is other studies to construction the free trade port. Also, there are some new issues facing China and the world. That is, first one is some politicians and scholars questioned the special political and economic system of China, as well as the lack of domestic rules in China. The second is, for our academic circle, is studied how to help China to make her contributions to the global governance more effective and more efficiency. The third question is any suggestions for the international communities to work together with China and get the real benefit for the world. Next year, we'll organize a forum of China's global economic governors to discuss what I mentioned, the series questions, and I hope welcome all of you to Guangzhou to make your contribution, and that's my presentation. Thank you. Next one, I'll invite Dr. Axel to give his presentation.
So thank you very much, Professor Zhao, for inviting me to this panel and for organizing this panel on this very important topic, and obviously also big thanks to ICTSD for organizing this TSDS, which I'm sure will provide a wonderful venue to discuss a number of issues that are important in terms of global economic governance these days. Now, we're living in an international trade and investment environment where we have a lack of leadership. That's quite obvious if you look at to the north, obviously, and one country where many people think that should and can fill this vacuum is obviously China. Many hope that China will be a supporter of multilateralism, of reform of global economic governance. So I think it's a very topical issue, and I'm very happy to discuss these issues with you today. I will focus on investment. I will discuss what kind of actor in global economic governance and investment governance China has been in the past, and what we can expect from China, in particular with regard to the reform of international investment policies, international investment agreements, which is a topic which is very high on the agenda these days. So, China played a very, very important role, as Professor Zhao already alluded to, in particular with regard to the G20 summit, where China proposed a deepening and a broadening of the trade and investment agenda of the G20. One of the important outcomes of the Hangzhou summit was the adoption of 9 guiding principles. And according to James Zhang from the UNCTAD, these 9 guiding principles could lay the foundation for a global consensus building on key issues for 21st century investment governance. So China played a very, very important role here. These are still non-binding principles, but this this could be a first step to a multilateralization of international investment governance. And it's obviously a very important normative framework to think about the reform of international investment governance. So against this background, against the background of China proposing to discuss issues of, can you still hear me? Yeah. Of investment facilitation in the WTO, I would like to discuss the question, what role will China play in the reform of international investment policies? Obviously, discussing China as a case is very relevant, right? China is the second largest host country for inward FDI. It's the second largest home country of outward foreign direct investments. It's second in terms of bilateral investment treaties that are in force. It started to include investment rules in its preferential trade agreement. It had signed 7 of those PTIAs in the past 10 years. There are a number of ISDS cases that are based on bilateral investment treaties signed by China. China has been the respondent, but also Chinese companies have sued other countries. So China, and that's quite obvious, I'm sure, is a very, very relevant actor when we think about the reform of global economic governance, in particular in the investment area. So let's have a look back. Let's have a look at what kind of investment treaties China has signed in the past. So I would propose to divide Chinese investment treaties in 4 generations. The first treaty was signed in 1982 with Sweden. In the 1980s, China signed rather restrictive treaties. So, for example, China refused to include broad and comprehensive ISDS, investor-state dispute settlement, provision in its treaties. There was no national treatment in these treaties, which were based on the European model. I'm not sure to what extent you are all familiar with international investment agreements. The European model is a very slim, a very short type of agreement, roughly 10 pages long, with rather vague, open-ended treatment provisions. But still, these provisions provide a lot of protection for investors and a lot of room for interpretation for ISDS tribunals. So these are quite controversial treaties in terms of the outcomes, in terms of how investors use these treaties to sue other countries to protect their rights. So, first generation of investment treaties signed in the 1980s, rather restrictive treaties. Then, in the second phase, China continued to sign those treaties in terms of their contents, but while in the first generation, China signed these treaties mainly with capital exporters from Europe, but also from Asia. In the 1990s, China signed those treaties, and a large number of those treaties, with developing countries. Then, from the second to the third generation, an interesting shift happened. China, for the first time in 1998, adopted ISDS, comprehensive ISDS provisions, and gave Chinese investors, but also other investors, or the investors of the partner countries, broad access to ISDS. And China continues with this practice. Obviously, these treaties are still signed on the basis of this European model. And another interesting shift happened in roughly 10 years ago, when China started to shift from a European model to the North American model. That's a type of investment treaty that was kind of invented in the US, in Canada, and Mexico, so in the NAFTA area, which is much longer, roughly 60 pages or even more. So the treatment provisions are more refined, they are more detailed. These treaties typically include market access provisions, so a very different type of treaty. China signed a number of those treaties. So, and I describe this as a gradual NAFTAization of China's investment treaty practice. Many argue that we have to look at investment flows in order to understand the drivers of this, of these changing generations of Chinese investment treaties. Many observers point at growing outward foreign direct investments from China as a driver of Chinese investment treaties. I have my doubts, and if I look at recent data, let me substantiate this, or let me explain why I have my doubts. So if we look at investment flows, for example, we saw obviously a growth of of FDI inward FDI to China that started in the early 1990s. We saw outward foreign direct investments from China to the world starting to become significant roughly 10 years ago. So. And recently, just last year, outward FDI was stronger than inward FDI from a Chinese perspective. If we compare that to the contents of Chinese investment treaties, and I try to capture the contents with a legal strength score, we saw that in the end of 1990s, Chinese treaties became stronger. That's particularly because of the inclusion of comprehensive ISDS provisions, of national treatment provisions. But that was a time when outward FDI was still very, very low, right? And at the time when outward FDI became significant from a Chinese perspective, so when there were more Chinese companies who needed this kind of legal protection, China started to shift to the more balanced approach, where investment protection was kind of reduced in a sense, and also in order to provide host countries with more regulatory space. So there's a puzzle, right? If we look only at the domestic preferences, at the preferences of the Chinese companies and the government. So we have to look for other explanations for Chinese investment treaty policy. And I would propose to use the international policy diffusion lens, where the policies one country adopts influences the policies of other countries. So let's focus, because I'm focusing on the possible contribution of China for the reform of global investment governance. Let's focus on the fourth generation of Chinese investment treaties. What explains this shift from the European model to a NAFTA-inspired model? Obviously, the background is a growing number of ISDS cases. Governments rethink their previous policies. In particular, the US, you know, a number of cases, ISDS cases, happened in the NAFTA countries. So it was in particular the US which started to rethink its approach, started to have more balanced approach to investor protection and to the protection of the regulatory space of the host countries. So we moved from a maximum protection to a more balanced approach, which I call NAFTAization of international investment governance. So we also see a gradual NAFTAization of Chinese investment treaties. And the interesting fact is that China, and that's one of the main points I would like to make today, China is very flexible in terms of the model treaties it uses when negotiating its investment treaties. So China is very happy to accept the model treaty put on the table by the partner country. So that's very different compared to the US or the EU, which is using its own model treaties. So China signed a number of treaties based on the model text put on the table by countries like Canada or Mexico or Peru or New Zealand, which were inspired by the NAFTA approach. So if you look at these treaties, you see that you can see this NAFTAization of Chinese investment treaties. But this adoption of balanced provisions was not coherent, so that also hints that China has no own model text. And another interesting fact is that China still continued to sign these old, traditional European type of treaties with countries like Switzerland, Malta, or African states. China was only coherent in terms of its defensive interests, so still China refuses to sign up to market access provision and gave investors a right for market access. So let me conclude and provide some ideas for further discussion. What is obvious, China's role in international investment governance is growing, right? With regard to the FDI flows, but also with regard to the international investment agreements. That's a very obvious point, and China is a very important actor. But China has not yet turned this economic importance into a more proactive international investment agreement policy as we see it from the US, or as we see it from the EU's point of perspective, so the typical capital exporters. So China is not yet such a typical capital exporter. So China is happy to sign treaties based on the preferences, on the model text put on the table by the partner countries. And so the question is whether China can play a proactive role in the reform of global economic governance. And that's just a question I would like to put on the table for the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Later on, learn from other trade partners, especially from the trade agreement they also make the investment part now is more perfected, more complex, like the legal document already. Now let's move to the Cristian, please.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, of course, ICTSD and everyone for being here, and you especially for inviting us. My presentation is really a bit of a part two of Axel's presentation, in which I'm also going to be walking a little bit through investment policies in China, but more with the question of this shifting global roles that we're currently seeing. What are the implications of that, China's protagonism for the investment regime? So I think we already saw a little bit of the progress of China's investment policy, and what I want to do is really address your very last question: is what can actually be the role of China in in this new economic order, in this vacuum that it's been creating at this moment. And the way I wanted to start is that it's with a story that about two and a half years ago with Ricardo here and Professor Carl Savant also in the audience, we were working on the E15 investment task force. So we were mandated to think long term and to think, in the next 10 years, how is the investment policy landscape going to look like? And a couple of colleagues and I wrote a paper which central thesis was that with the advent of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was, steaming ahead, and of course the U.S.-China bilateral investment treaty also in their, final part of negotiations, in the RCEP, the Pacific Alliance, TTIP coming forward, and others, we were really coming towards convergence and a little bit of kind of the end of history, scenario on investment, with all this spaghetti ball really reducing itself and creating these gold standards and coming really to a much more coherent investment regime. But then this happened, right? And then we got, the backlash against the mega regional agreements, who were supposed to be finished at the time, not only on TPP. TTIP's investment chapter got, as you know, 150,000 comments, mostly negative on the ISDS provision. We also, this happened, as all of you in Europe and the world know, and of course, finally, the U.S. election. And also, with the election of President Trump, the abandonment of TPP from the U.S. side, and also a large questioning in NAFTA happening right now. So I'm not here to discuss the reasonings of this backlash, but I think we can all agree on that. We're currently in a vacuum of political leadership on trade. So the question that I asked then again, what was happening in China at the time, right? And I think in China we were seeing a little bit of a different, and we are seeing a little bit of a different picture. The same day that President Trump was inaugurated in Washington, President Xi Jinping was in Davos delivering a very robust defense of globalization. At the same time, as Axel has said very well, China keeps on expanding not only its BIT network, but its FTA network, and negotiating with the world, growing its net. And as you see also, a big push from the Chinese side on the regional integration, and most notably, I think, the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank being incredibly important. Of course, China more and more a protagonist in APEC, really pushing, being the strength behind the negotiations of the FTAIP, the free trade area of the Asia Pacific, that of course faces a lot of hurdles, but China is still the engine behind that. RCEP, which although it's not a Chinese lead negotiation, of course is very important in the Asian region, and of course the Belt and Road that the professor already referred, and we'll come back to it in a minute, as a central, it's a central strategy for Chinese going overseas. But I think that's also important to understand the cultural significance of what does it mean a global China, right? We're talking about an empire that, at its height still built a wall to kind of border itself out, of their neighbors. So it's a country which, of course, seeks to integrate globally and seeks to work with the world, but it's also very comfortable being at the center. Now, I love this map because, of course, most maps have Europe or the America at the center, but this map with China in the center, it's one I really like, and I just, the thesis is like no overarching integration ambition because the empire is already in the middle, right? But let me run I think just to see if we are actually on board of this change, just a little test with you, and I think it's from everyone here in the audience, it'll be pretty clear that you can name these 5 personalities here, right? But if I will ask you, like, to very quickly give me the names of these 5 persons, can you? We've seen them before, right? I'm sure, and of course we all recognize President Xi, but maybe Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, a little bit lag behind, right? And I think this is a problem. This is particularly a Western problem in which we really, although we all agree we know how important is China, I think there's a bit of lag in understanding, not only the political relevance of China, but also the dimension, right? And I think this is another slide which for me is really interesting, which really compares the GDP of Chinese cities with countries. So if you are, from the Netherlands, you'll be happy to know that your economy is the size of Shanghai. I'm from Chile, so Hangzhou it's really close to my heart now because it's about the size of my country. And Argentina, you have to go no farther than Hangzhou to realize that that's about the size of the whole economy of this country. So I think it's important also. We all talk about the size of China, but really understand the level of shift that we're having here. And again, going back to the central point of this conversation is what is the implication for the global economic order, and in particular for investment, right? And I think one of them is, again, China going global. Again, this is President Xi in Davos in January this year, which was, of course, a landmark for the World Economic Forum, but I think also for China. And going back again into investment, I think this is the similar slide than Axel was showing a little bit earlier on. The story, it's really the red line, So of course we all know about countries going and investing in China, but the way in which the outflows just in the last 5 years have gone at 145%, and as Axel very well mentioned, they are now the outflows of China are even larger than the inflows of China. We can discuss if the shift within the treaties has really been caused by the outflows, and I would actually agree with Axel that there is a bit of a master plan which came before this, and I think in a very Chinese way, China of course anticipated this, I think, but I will agree that the changes in the framework were actually a little bit more anticipating the spike in the graph that in a reactive manner. And then, if you take where is that investment going, of course, then you understand the plans that China has for the region and the world, and in particular, we come back here to the Belt and Road, right? The Belt and Road Initiative, and you see, 49% of Chinese ODI. I believe these are 2014 numbers, but I'll probably have to check that. Or 2015 numbers, sorry. But you get the Belt and Road there, of course, and I'm sure Professor has already touched upon it, but, 60 countries, 6 major economies, and numbers which are really mind-blowing, with two couple of development banks also supporting the initiative, and so on. So I think that more than touching on the Belt and Road, which is, I think, known by all of us, and the size of it, and also I think when the professor was talking about the big summits happening in China, I think the 4th one, he talked about the APEC, the G20, and BRICS, but the Belt and Road Summit that she put together in China earlier this year with a number of heads of state and something was also, I mean, I had the opportunity to be there. It's something I have seen very few gatherings of that size, and I think of that projection and of that power that is held, and especially in these times. But take not only the Belt and Road, right? Take not only Asia, but just let's go to a 5%. So we're in Argentina, so let's talk about Latin America, and only with this 5% of Chinese ODI, these are the effects, right? Of course, China to become the top destination of Latin exports in 2017, 1.8 million jobs created in Latin America by China over 2 decades, and if you take my country, Chile, for example, top exporter exports of Chile going to China, and more we're seeing investments coming into Latin America and shifting our investment landscape, a bit more diversity within those investments, will be welcome. But the fact is, those investments are here to stay. So again, just about the impact that this shifting landscape has in the world. Axel was talking about the BITs, and I think what I will just pick up from that is that it's not just about the numbers, and you see spiking curve, China being the first or second, I believe, the country with the amount of BITs in the world, but exactly what Axel was saying. I think it's about the quality, right? It's about the type of BITs. It's about what are you picking up now? And he talked about the different stages of protection in China, and I think again a big after the 2008 kind of like stage 3. I think another big moment is in 2013, when China actually accepted, to continue the negotiations of the U.S.-China investment treaty on a negative list basis, right? So this is basically China, of course, in a very Chinese way, also started, trying negative lists through pilot free trade zones, the very famous Shanghai Free Trade Zone, but a number of others. And once it was ready, it was said, okay, now we're ready to actually negotiate with some huge country as the U.S. on this basis. So I think that, again, this is already super covered by Axel, but I think this is a little bit of the next frontier again, the China-U.S. bid, which of course at the moment it's going to see very little progress. But I mean, in personal opinion, I don't think it's absolutely dead in the water. I think, depending on how things progress in the future, this may be something that can be picked up. Again, the China-EU investment treaty also a little bit complicated now with the ECJ ruling on the competence of the Commission to negotiate investment treaties. But again, I think we're seeing two very large framework agreements that could define China's investment policy in the future. So is China going global with this? I think it's fair to say so. And again, Alex just walked us over the policies and how they're changing. On the cases, China still has the advantage of not having very much involved, of course, because the older treaties also had a number of provisions which made it difficult for ISDS claims to be brought. But China is already today a global player on this. And the question, and with this I finish, the question that I will ask is, how much is China going to engage also on the multilateral and plurilateral efforts on investment policy making? And I think a crucial one that is just starting, is the UNCITRAL, the United Nations Commission for International Trade Law, that has agreed to actually start analyzing the issue of reform of IFDS. It held their first meeting on this, the so-called Working Group 3 on reform of IFDS just a couple of weeks ago in Vienna, and of course, at the very start, it's going to be definitely a very complicated negotiation, and I'm not sure times are ripe for multilateralism, and the US and the EU a little bit confronted on that side, and it will be very interesting to see where China comes from in that discussion. In the same way, of course, with the EU-China negotiation, what is going to be the role for the multilateral investment court proposal, which the EU and Canada and other countries are pushing, and where is China going to be on that page? And I think one really good example of China's leadership is the G20, which Axel referred to. I mean, it's a major landmark of investment policy, having at least throughout those 20 countries. Even they're criticized because they may be soft or so, but I mean, this is the U.S., China, India, Russia, sitting together and saying, look, when we make investment treaties, this is more or less how it should look like, and includes issues of market access and others. So I think this is a really good sign of what can we be seeing from China, from China in the future. And the very last thing, which is relevant to this conference, I think, is the issue of investment facilitation, which is a little bit of a softer discussion. It is what it's really possible to at least talk at the WTO, because of course you wouldn't be able to talk about ISDS or other issues. But the news here is China is of course a big proponent, right? And they are part of the Friends of Investment Facilitation for Development group, and of course for China it makes a lot of sense. Just take the Belt and Road. It's not only about inwards investment now, but it's also about outwards investment. And of course, if you can establish frameworks or help to facilitate your investment, let's say, with those 60 countries in the Belt and Roads, of course, it makes a lot of sense. So China is definitely going to be behind that. So let's see what to expect here on those discussions for MC11. I'll say not much, but at least, if we can create a framework or at least a mood to keep the conversation going forward, I think that will already be a victory and will keep us busy on something that can actually deliver on the ground, deliver on the ground in the next coming year. So that's my presentation.
Thank you, Cristian. We'll remember you because you have very interesting test about the American leaders and the Chinese leaders. Another thing we'll remember you, you are very familiar with the Chinese situation, even not only the whole China, but only the different cities. In fact, in the World Economic Forum, they have two sessions. One is the winter session. It's used in Davos. But another summer session is in China. Every year will be either in Dalian or in Tianjin in China. So I think we have very close relationship with the World Economic Forum. Now I'd like to move to the third speaker. Is about Miss Anabel Gonzalez. She's topic is about China and the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Please welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. And I'd like to move a little bit more from investment to like the other side of the coin, which is trade, and relate this with the Sustainable Development Goal #1, which is poverty eradication and the role of China in this. So let me start by saying that China has seen an outstanding success in reducing poverty. Since it began its market reforms in the late 1970s, China has lifted more than 800 million people out of poverty, slashing the rate from nearly 90%, 88% actually, in 1981 to 2% today, as measured by the World Bank Group, $1.90 a day for poverty rate. There are different rates out there, but in any case, the reality is the success is amazing. No country has made a greater contribution to the goal of ending global poverty than China. The second point that I want to make is that extreme poverty decline has been inseparable from the global trading system. When poor countries sell cheap goods to rich countries or bring in a lot of foreign direct investment, growth skyrockets. And this basically means more jobs, better government services, and less poverty. And China is, of course, a dramatic example of this. Its incredible growth since 1981 comes mostly from exports. And even today, with the rebalancing of the economy, exports represent 23% of China's GDP. Now, in China, and I find this to be a very impressive number, in China, between 1978 and 2015, the number of people in non-farm jobs as a percentage of total employment moved from 29% to 70%. That is basically the structural reform that happened in the Chinese economy, which moved its population from farm jobs, which are basically subsistence jobs, into non-farm jobs, is quite amazing because it's the fastest that we have ever seen in history. So the third point is that notwithstanding this great success, the task of eradicating poverty by 2030, again, which is the sustainable goal #1, is far from complete in China and elsewhere in the globe. In China, and again, this varies a little bit depending on the measure that you use, but there are still about 50 million people living in poverty, which if we use the metrics that Cristian very nicely presented, that would be roughly a country a little bit larger than the size of Argentina. So still a big number of people still living in extreme poverty. And this is why President Xi recently launched an ambitious plan to complete the eradication of rural poverty by the year 2020. That is 3 years from now. Moreover, many who have escaped extreme poverty are still vulnerable, and in a scenario of decreased growth, they could easily wind up falling back into poverty. And of course, there are still 800 million people out there living on less than $1.90 a day, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. So the fourth point that I want to make is that to end poverty, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal #1, global cooperation is needed to reinvigorate trade reform. And China has an important stake in it. So the global economy as a whole is in a period of strengthening growth, and a tepid uptick in global trade has played a part. But the reality is that overall, the current trade context is very challenging, as we know, and trade is not the engine that it once was. So prospects of trade liberalization at the global level have weakened significantly. Hopefully that could turn in the context of this week. And in the regional level, it has sort of seesaw. There are some positive signals, but then some not very positive signals. So the lack of momentum, in the trade negotiations arena in the past 18 months is particularly acute. But the reality is that it comes on top of longer trends of diminished trade liberalization since the early 2000s. So this stagnation basically hampers the potential increased benefits of trade and investment in new growth areas such as services and e-commerce. And I'd like to make a parenthesis here to say that in China, for example, e-commerce is playing a very important role in bringing people out of poverty, including from the rural areas and women as well. And it also hampers the possibility of achieving progress in long-standing areas that are very important for poverty reaction, like for poverty elimination, like agriculture. So again, global cooperation to reinvigorate trade growth is extremely important if we are to eradicate poverty in China and in the world more broadly. I would like to conclude with 2 words of caution that I think are important both for China and more broadly. The first, of course, is that trade and investment are not an end in itself, but means to promote prosperity. So it is very important that they be embedded in broader national strategies that would include efforts to build a more conducive environment for growth, the need to equip people with the tools and the skills that are necessary to reap the benefits of open markets, and policies to mitigate adjustment costs that may be derived from technology, trade, or other shocks. And the second point is that for trade to play an increasing role in eliminating poverty, it needs to be inclusive trade. And this is important in terms of putting in place a number of policies in parallel that may address the specific circumstances of those living in poverty. And if you look at this, these are basically people who are in the rural area, that are in informality. Poverty increasingly has the face of a woman, and poverty is also related to, of course, very present in fragile and conflict states. So policies that address the specific challenges of these different categories of people living in poverty can complement or should complement the reinvigorated trade cooperation at the multilateral level or at the regional level to be able to, or for countries to be able to achieve the eradication of poverty, again, the Sustainable Development Goal #1. So thank you very much, Professor Zhao.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Anabel. Very interesting the topic about the eradicated poverty. Now we have the fourth speaker is Bernard Hoekman, Professor Bernard Hoekman, but he just sent me a messenger. He's playing a little bit late and maybe not arrive at our time. We still have some more time. I think we can raise some questions. And if you have any questions, ask the panelists to answer. I open to the audience. Yes, gentlemen.
I have a question for actually all panelists.
Microphone. Wait a moment. Yeah.
Sorry, I start again. Carl Savant, Columbia University. I have a question for all panelists, including Anabel, even though the question is on investment. It has been pointed out that the guiding principles were a major achievement, and I would agree. They were adopted, but then I have the impression nothing happened. Not even a simple study looking to what extent the guiding principles are already reflected in old agreements, or to what extent they are new agreements, or maybe annotate them. They were accepted, they disappeared. Why? Thank you.
Maybe I think we have 2 more questions, then answer a question together. Okay.
I've got a question for second speaker, Professor Alex Berger. It's very interesting that you note that China has been not consistent in negotiating BITs with other countries or investment chapter contained in FTA in recent years. You notice that inconsistency and also try to explain why. I have been thinking whether this inconsistency also relates to China's bargaining power. You mentioned that China has been very flexible in negotiating BITs. But I wonder, this flexibility also to some extent relates to China's bargaining power, particularly bargaining power with respect to its like rulemaking capacity in international investment treaties. I wonder if you have some comments on my thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shi. Another one. Okay, you. Here.
Thank you very much, Sherry Stevenson, ICTSD. Very interesting panel. I would like to ask our chair, Dr. Zhao, if within China itself there has appeared any controversy around the ISDS mechanism, as we've seen in so many other countries around the world, and which is now the basis for the review of this mechanism that Cristian mentioned. It's ongoing now, or starting at UNCITRAL. Has there been any controversy? Not China, you mentioned, has been involved in 9 ISDS cases, and so I wonder if these have generated any type of backlash or controversy at home.
Okay, thank you. Next round, we just ask the panelists to answer these 3 questions. I think, Alex? Axel?
Okay, let me start with a question with regard to the consistency and whether that relates to the bargaining power. Well, first of all, in terms of rule-making capacity, I think I have the impression, talking to not only Chinese negotiators, but the whole and also the investment lawyers, investment law experts that are in China, that are based in in cities like Xiamen, Xi'an, Wuhan. I have the impression they know what they are talking about. So these are really, really good experts. So that seems not to be the problem, right? And now with regard to bargaining power, if you look at the countries where, with which China negotiated these more balanced agreements, these are countries like Peru, these are countries like Mexico, New Zealand, Australia, where you would not expect that China is in a weaker position in terms of bargaining power. Even a country like Tanzania managed to, I think it was a reference to sustainable development in the preamble, it managed to convince China to include such a provision that was of interest for Tanzania in the bilateral investment agreement. So I don't think that either the capacity or the knowledge of the Chinese negotiators nor the rulemaking power or the bargaining power is an issue here. So we have to look for other explanations, and I tried to come up with a couple of explanations. I'm tempted to answer the question of Mr. Sauvant, but maybe the others would like to have a first go.
That was smart.
Yes. Great.
Thanks. Maybe just a comment on the flexibility. I agree, of course, that there's a lot of different models and strategies on China. I think that may be changing going forward. I think it's really important. I was just looking at this. There's a landmark change on the Chinese domestic investment law. It happened in 2016, right? In the September 2016 major overhaul of the 3-decade-old network of Chinese investment laws, basically moving the Chinese screening system from a case-by-case approval system to a kind of a negative list and filling in for records system. I think that's going to open a lot more space for negative lists and on the BATs, and then for a more standard approach for negotiation. And I think that was the plan since China starting to foresee this again in a very Chinese way, since starting with the pilot free trade zones. I'm bringing in investment on a negative list basis there. Okay, works in Shanghai. Okay, we move with the next one. Then fine, we'll try to do it with the U.S. Then next we change our investment laws, and so I would think that going forward we'll have more possibilities to see Chinese a little bit more aligned on their investment policy. On the G20 principles, Carl. I think it's realpolitik, right? It's really. I mean, if I've heard it from a fellow negotiator, from a negotiator friend that said that if this would have been tried the year after, I'm sure we wouldn't even get it to a title, right? So, I mean, it was the G20 investment principles were, I think, an achievement not only in the sense of what's on them, but if you would have gone around the room, 2 months before they were adopted, I think the mood would have been a little bit like the mood across the river here for this week. It came as a surprise, I would say, and then it just takes time, So I think I still think very highly about the value of these principles, but I think now. The moment now to come with the principles, and take this flag and say, okay, we all agreed on this, and now we know, let's move on with the standard. I think you're going to create something against the principles themselves that you don't want. So I think smartly so, the principles are letting a little bit, are a little bit sleeping for now, but they will be, recalled, I think, when necessary and when you want to build a broader framework. And I am sure. On the discussions on UNCITRAL, the G20 investment principles are going to definitely have a role. But again, it's happening before. APEC in 2010 or something, 9 or 10, adopted guidelines for investment negotiators, and you have things like that then are. I remember trying to research actually the guidelines, and I couldn't even find them, and then I ended up finding them. But so I think this is a major achievement that is just through to the political. Situation, it's a little bit lagging behind, but perhaps a role for institutes and universities like yours and people like you that can be bringing the academic and the knowledge vision behind.
I think I would agree with Cristian. I think the principals just got caught in bad timing. They almost, the thrust of the backlash came about almost immediately after the principles came out. So to me, it's a question that the time is not conducive. The environment is not conducive. But this does not demerit in any way on the principles. It's not a reflection on the principles itself. I think they may come back in a different iteration at a different time, and they can still play a role. And maybe in this period of hibernation, yes, others could actually take a look at them and see, is there, with the network of bilateral investment treaties and investment chapters that is already out there, is there something, are the principles already actually embedded in this sort of non-system that we have in the area of investment?
If I may add a sentence on this.
Yeah.
I think the German chair of the G20 just had no appetite to put the international investment policy reform on the agenda. Germany suggested to focus on investment facilitation, an issue which is much more uncontroversial, much more focused on the national context. So, and there are, from my perspective, two reasons why Germany did not put investment policy reform on the table. First of all, we had a very, very serious debate about ISDS in Germany in relation to TTIP. I think the German government learned its lesson, and we had an election just in September this year. So Germany, I guess, did not want to risk to have another public debate on ISDS, on investment rules. And then there's the European context, which is also very difficult. We had this discussion, I think we still have it, between the member states and the European Union. Who has the responsibility for investment? So I think Germany also tried to have a cautious approach to that, and not to have any discussions with the European level on who's responsible for what, and that's why they didn't put it on the agenda during Germany's G20 year. But maybe other countries will bring it up again. But again, I think there's still not much appetite in the international community to really discuss it with President Trump in the room. I think we'll have to wait for a little bit, or try other venues like Ancestral.
If I may just add, there's a little bit of literature on this on the E15, on our World Economic Forum E15, ICTSD project website. There's a paper by James Shan on the process, and also a paper by Anna Juvan Brett, both on also the World Economic Forum platform, both of the process and the expectations for the principles, so you can find that there.
Let me go back to the last question about China's attitude to the ISDS. There is really a change before, because the investment treaty, they have two basic objectives. One is to protect the investment benefit. Another one also need to protect the public interest. For China, at the very beginning, pay much attention about the public interest. So at the very beginning, China a little bit discussed the ISDS articles in a bilateral investment treaty. But now China also pay a more balanced attitude, and also study the ISDS treaties, and pay more attention to protest the investment benefit. I fully agree with you. There is a different change, and ISDS now is become more and more important in the bilateral investment treaties. Thank you. Now we have about 5 minutes, so I think I have another 2 questions. One is from this lady, another one. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much.
That gentleman. Okay, last 2 questions, please.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you to all the speakers. It was very impressive and eye-opening for all of us. I'm Pınar Ertuğrul with Istanbul Big University, and I'm the WTO chairholder. Actually, I would like to take a little bit from the investment aspect. I would think that it would be a little bit unfortunate not to talk about, you know, the recent dispute about non-market economy status of China. With all due respect, I would like to hear your views on how this, you know, dispute between the European Union, United States, and China regarding whether China is a market economy will affect, including the investment protection and all of the thinking. Because, I mean, as I can see as a lawyer, as a trade lawyer, I think this is a bomb ticking inside the World Trade Organization. And I'm trying to understand whether the claim is, whether China claims that it's a market economy, or the claim is that, according to the WTO agreements, it is its right to be now recognized as a market economy. And depending on how we know that the EU implemented new rules now with the approval of the European Parliament, which will soon go into force, whether market distortion is being done by the states. So how this will affect. And the second question, which is linked to it, we all are thinking about the gap in the leadership. But last week there was an article which was published in Politico, and I found it very interesting because that piece argues that the EU is now the new leader. It's filling the gap that the United States created just because of the EU-Japan Free Trade Agreement, which was announced last week. But as we can see, actually, and from the discussion which is ongoing, it's perhaps as China is going to fill the gap. So how do you approach the intertwined relationship, or the look at the future when you look at the EU and China, which is more likely to fill the gap? Obviously, it's going to be a little bit speculation, but what is your sense of who is going to be the next leader of the international trading system and anchoring? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Madam. Another gentleman.
Hi, good morning. Joshua Mike with the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Just wanted to get your thoughts on the rising energy demands in relation to the incredible economic growth that China has had in the last 10 years. Certainly that's driving energy demand, energy generation and consumption to fuel future growth, and just wanted to get general opinions on future energy needs and generation. Thanks.
Thank you. Anabel?
I'm going to refer to the second question on leadership at the multilateral level to say that if you think that leadership is normally correlated with economic power in the system, and if you look at the participation today of the U.S., of Europe, and China in global trade, you will see that it's roughly, I mean, it's very similar. Each of them account for about $4 trillion in global trade, and that together combined is about 45% of global trade. So this means that I find it unlikely that only one country will be able to drive the multilateral trading system. At least there are three very important countries or including the EU as one, members, if you wish, that have an important responsibility. But also, there's the other 55% of global trade. So increasingly, in going forward, I think that you will need to see leadership from these three members, but also greater participation from other parts of the world in reinvigorating the global trading system. I don't think there is just one single member who can actually do that.
Thank you, Anabel. Cristian?
Yes, I will absolutely agree with that. Of course, we are, I guess you're based in Turkey. Also, we're based in the European Union, so we heard a lot about, the new policies and progressive agenda of the European Union. But again, I think it's also a little bit, there's a bit of the bias of where we're sitting, right? So if you're talking about the investment discussion, there's a lot of conversation about, providing the necessary policy space and reforming the investment agreements because all the agreements that we have on record are not really kind of providing that space. But if you just cross the ocean and go to the U.S., and U.S. negotiator will tell you that NAFTA actually provides that space, you know, and with the environmental exceptions and labor exceptions and a number of interpretive notes that the Free Trade Commission had for NAFTA, so on and so forth. So what my only point here is that there's I think there's a little bit of a regional caveat from us coming from Europe, as seeing as Europe only driving this agenda, and I will completely agree that, of course, China, again, as I mentioned in my presentation, a major player on outlining this, and again, as Anabel said, in a fraction world, what I forgot to say when I was doing my presentation about this idea of convergence is that my theory, of course, miserably failed, right? So in a fraction world, there's a lot of regional leadership that are important. If you take trade, I think, if you take ASEAN, go to Latin America, the Pacific Alliance, the efforts of now here in Argentina, right, bringing the Pacific Alliance closer to Mercosur, you know, just all these different components summing up, I think they're increasing the importance. So there's not just one. Maybe a small comment on the energy question. Of course, I think no one more aware than China of this pressing need, right? And if you're talking about policy shifts, just take the stance of China with regards to the UNFCCC, right, to the COP negotiations, and how China, you know, came through in Durban, came through again in Paris. Again, if you're talking about the renewable energy industry, you know, most of the industry is coming from China. Let's talk about solar panels, so on and so forth. Right? Okay, there are the reasons for that. That's fine, but I think, of course, China is just doing what it can, you know, on the renewable side to try to stay attuned of the need. But of course, the need is just larger than the provision of the good here. So I think it's an incredibly complicated topic. We've seen, as in the U.S., you know, perhaps, you know, further abundance of shale gas and moving matrix to less pollutant factors helps, but of course I think it's going to be running the agenda for the next few years. And how do you keep powering up, of course, this fancy factor?
Thank you. Okay, 1 minute for Axel.
Okay. Well, the issue that is left is maybe the most controversial one: the non-market economy status of China. I'm not a lawyer, so I will not comment on the legal aspects. I think it's just a matter of fact that China should be granted the market economy status in the WTO. But obviously, it's a very, very political question. So, and it is a question which has a very, very serious side effects. Right? Just think about when I think it was the Chinese environment minister was in Europe and tried to sign up a joint declaration on climate in response to the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement. They were not able to sign up to this declaration because of this discussion of the market economy status, because China brought it up in these negotiations that were on climate. So it has very, very serious side effects, and it could be really an issue which is tearing the WTO apart, right? If you think about the U.S. trying to use this leverage to really push through its negative agenda in the WTO, and so it's very, very serious. I would totally agree.
Okay, thank you, Axel. The time is running out, but I just make a conclusion. Is the no market question is not a political or system issue. It's only a trade remedy issue that is relative to the approach to calculate the margin about the anti-dumping or the countervailing duty, not a political system. So don't think about a market economy or no market economy for China. It's only a trade remedy issues. Another one is the gap to leadership. I think I fully agree with other panelists. They need to work together and cooperated together and share the result together. And finally, I thank you joining us this morning. And let's, with our big applaud, thanks thank the panelists. Thank you all. Okay, end our session. Thank you.